3,000 years ago, on a hilltop above Jerusalem, inside a building that took 7 years to build, the most magnificent structure the ancient world had ever seen, sat a single object so dangerous that only one person alive was allowed to come near it. Once a year, after weeks of purification, in a windowless chamber where the smallest mistake meant death, a man approached a wooden chest the size of a coffee table, sealed in gold, carried always on poles so no hand would ever touch it directly. According to the record, this object had already brought down the walls of a fortified city, killed a man instantly for reaching out to steady it, and spread plague through an entire enemy nation that dared to carry it off as a war trophy. It was the Ark of the Covenant, the most feared, most documented, most sacred object in the Hebrew Bible. And then, somewhere between one verse and the next, in the final years before Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE, it vanished. No army claimed to destroy it. No scribe recorded where it went. No grave, no ruin, no confession, nothing. The most important object in 3,000 years of religious history disappeared without a trace. And when an advanced AI system was asked to lay out everything the historical and scientific record actually says about what happened to it, the answer it gave didn't disturb people because it revealed something hidden. It disturbed people because it confirmed the one thing theologians have quietly feared for 25 centuries, that the truth might be the most uncomfortable answer of all. To understand why the disappearance of this single chest has haunted scholars, believers, and treasure hunters for 2,500 years, you first have to understand what it was reported to actually do. This was not a passive relic that sat quietly on a shelf collecting dust and reverence. According to the ancient text, it was active. It responded. And more than once, it killed. When the Philistines defeated the Israelites in battle and captured the ark as a trophy of war, they carried it into their own territory and placed it inside the temple of their god, Dagon. The next morning, the idol of Dagon was found lying face down on the ground in front of the ark, as though it had bowed. The priests set the statue upright again. The following morning, it was not only knocked down a second time, its head and hands had broken off entirely. Soon after, a wave of affliction swept through the Philistine population. Tumors spread among the people, and the fields around them became infested with rodents. The Philistines moved the ark from city to city, hoping to rid themselves of the plague, but wherever it went, sickness followed. Eventually, in desperation, they loaded the ark onto a cart along with gold replicas of the tumors and rodents that had tormented them and sent it back to Israelite territory, unwilling to keep an object that punished everyone who held it. Years later, when King David attempted to bring the ark into Jerusalem, it was placed on a new cart pulled by oxen. At one point along the journey, the oxen stumbled and the cart tilted. A man named Uzzah, walking alongside, instinctively reached out his hand to keep the ark from falling. The moment his hand touched it, he was struck dead on the spot. The text describes it as a burst of divine anger, but strip away the theological framing for a moment, and what remains is a consistent, repeatable pattern. Contact with this object, under the wrong conditions, meant death. The pattern continues. When the ark rested for a time in the town of Beth Shemesh, a group of local residents opened it and looked inside, a violation of the strict rules governing who was permitted to view its contents. 70 of them reportedly died as a result. Later, when 2 sons of the high priest attempted an unauthorized ritual near the sacred tabernacle that housed the ark, a burst of fire consumed them instantly. Across multiple locations, multiple decades, and multiple unrelated groups of people, the story is always the same. Unauthorized contact, sudden violent death. No survivors of a mistake. If this were an isolated incident, you could dismiss it as folklore embellishment. But the consistency of the pattern, repeated across different books, different authors, different generations of the historical record, is exactly what has kept serious researchers from writing the whole story off as myth. That consistency is also what eventually pulled the ark out of the realm of pure theology and into the realm of applied physics. The idea that the ark might have been, in some sense, a machine, and not merely a symbol, is not a modern conspiracy theory invented for the internet age. It dates back to the 18th century, not long after the invention of the Leyden jar, one of the very first devices capable of storing an electrical charge. Early electrical scientists noticed something striking. The physical construction of the ark, as described in the biblical text, bore an uncanny resemblance to the internal structure of a capacitor. The ark was built as a wooden box, plated with gold on both the interior and the exterior surfaces, with the wood itself acting as an insulating layer between the 2 conductive layers of gold. That is, structurally, almost exactly how a capacitor is built. A capacitor's entire purpose is to store electrical energy and then release it, sometimes suddenly and sometimes violently, depending on how much charge has accumulated. Engineers who have studied the biblical description point to other details that fit disturbingly well into this framework. The 2 golden cherubim mounted on the lid, facing one another with their wings extended toward each other, have been compared to the electrodes of a capacitor. with the gap between their wingtips acting as the point where accumulated charge might arc and discharge. The long wooden poles used to carry the ark, specifically designed to prevent any human hand from making direct contact with the gold surface, read almost like a built-in safety protocol against exactly the kind of accidental discharge that killed Uzzah. Even the linen garments worn by priests who approached the ark have been reinterpreted under this theory as a rudimentary form of electrical insulation, protecting the wearer from a charge that might otherwise pass through the body and stop a heart. This is not fringe speculation confined to obscure blogs. Nikola Tesla himself engaged seriously with the electrical theory of the ark in the early 20th century, treating it as a legitimate structural question rather than dismissing it outright. The theory does have real weaknesses. Detailed physics analysis has shown that the kind of atmospheric or geomagnetic charge accumulation required to consistently produce lethal shocks would need very specific, very stable conditions. Conditions that don't line up well with an object that was frequently moved, handled, and transported across different environments. A device sitting undisturbed for long stretches could plausibly build up a dangerous static charge. An object being carried on poles across a desert on a regular basis would have a much harder time accumulating and holding that same charge consistently enough to explain every single documented death. Still, the fact that respected physicists and engineers have taken the comparison seriously, rather than treating it as pure fantasy, tells you something about how strange the original description actually is when read with modern scientific eyes instead of purely devotional ones. Whatever the ark actually was, a purely symbolic religious object, a genuinely dangerous piece of ancient engineering, or something in between that later storytellers exaggerated for theological effect, its place in Israelite religious life was undisputed. According to the biblical account, it contained the stone tablets inscribed with the Ten Commandments, and depending on which tradition you follow, it may also have held a container of manna from the wilderness wanderings and the staff belonging to Aaron. For nearly 400 years, it rested inside the Holy of Holies, the innermost and most sacred chamber of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, a space so restricted that only the high priest was permitted to enter, and only once annually on the Day of Atonement, after extensive ritual preparation. Then, during the reign of King Josiah in the final decades of the 7th century BCE, the ark receives what most scholars agree is its last confirmed mention in the historical record. Josiah instructs the priests to return it to its proper resting place within the temple, and then silence. Roughly 40 years later, in 586 BCE, the armies of the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, breached its walls, and burned Solomon's temple to the ground. The biblical record is meticulous about cataloging what was looted from the temple during that destruction. Detailed inventories exist, listing bronze pillars, basins, lampstands, and countless smaller ritual implements carried off by Babylonian soldiers. The Ark of the Covenant does not appear anywhere on that list. It is not recorded as stolen. It is not recorded as destroyed. It is simply conspicuously absent from every account of what happened during those final catastrophic days. That silence is the entire mystery in miniature. The most straightforward explanation, the one that most historians who study the period consider statistically the most likely, is also the explanation that believers across 3 millennia have found almost impossible to emotionally accept. Under this reading, the ark was destroyed alongside the rest of the temple's treasures when Nebuchadnezzar's forces set the building on fire. Its gold plating was likely melted down and absorbed into the general spoils of the Babylonian treasury, indistinguishable from any other looted gold once it left Jerusalem. Its wooden frame, exposed to the same flames that consumed the temple around it, would have simply burned. Later Jewish writings, including sections of the Mishnah, openly acknowledge that when the second temple was constructed after the Babylonian exile ended, it was built without the ark inside it. No returning exile ever claimed to bring it back. No later inventory of restored temple vessels ever mentions its return. If it had survived and been hidden somewhere, at some point across the following centuries, someone would likely have retrieved it, or at least someone would have claimed to. Instead, there is nothing, just absence, stretching outward across the following 600 years of Jewish history until the Second Temple itself was destroyed by Rome in 70 CE, this time with absolute certainty that the ark was never inside it. But an explanation this plain has never been enough to satisfy the emotional and theological weight the ark carried. An object described as capable of striking men dead, toppling enemy gods, and physically manifesting divine presence, simply melting down into anonymous scrap gold in a foreign treasury feels wrong on a level that goes beyond ordinary historical disappointment. It feels disproportionate. And so, almost as soon as the temple fell, alternative traditions began to take root, each one offering a version of events less bleak than total annihilation. The oldest of these alternative accounts comes from an apocryphal text known as Second Maccabees, written roughly 4 centuries after the Babylonian conquest. According to this account, the prophet Jeremiah, who personally witnessed the fall of Jerusalem, received a divine warning ahead of the invasion. Acting on that warning, Jeremiah is said to have removed the ark, along with the sacred tent of meeting and the altar of incense, and carried them to a cave on a mountain identified in the text as the same peak where Moses died generations earlier while gazing across the Jordan River at the land he would never enter. Jeremiah reportedly sealed the entrance to the cave and declared that its location would remain hidden until God chose, at some future point, to gather the scattered people of Israel back together. It is a genuinely moving story, poetic in structure and deeply resonant with the broader biblical narrative. It is also almost certainly a later theological invention, composed centuries after Jeremiah's lifetime, with no independent corroboration anywhere else in the historical or archaeological record. A second major tradition keeps the ark much closer to home, proposing that it never left Jerusalem at all, but was instead hidden somewhere beneath the temple complex itself before the Babylonians arrived. Later rabbinic writings, including portions of the Tosefta, record the opinion among certain rabbis that King Josiah, anticipating the coming destruction, ordered the ark concealed along with several other sacred objects, including a container of manna, the anointing oil, and the rod of Aaron. Decades ago, 2 Israeli researchers claimed to have identified tunnels and chambers beneath the Temple Mount that they believed had been used to conceal the ark before the siege. Neither claim was ever backed by verifiable physical evidence, and given that the Temple Mount today sits at the center of one of the most fiercely contested pieces of religious and political territory on the planet, shared uneasily among 3 major world religions, any serious excavation aimed at testing the theory remains essentially unthinkable. No government, religious authority, or archaeological body currently has the diplomatic room to attempt it, and that reality alone guarantees the theory can never be conclusively tested in the foreseeable future. Then, there is the claim that has captured more global popular imagination than any other, and which remains simultaneously the most institutionally committed and the most impossible to independently verify. The belief, held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, that the true Ark of the Covenant rests today in the city of Axum, guarded inside a treasury near the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. Every Ethiopian Orthodox church maintains a replica of the tablets said to have been contained within the Ark, called a tablet, each one housed in its own restricted inner sanctuary modeled on the original Holy of Holies. The origin story for how the Ark supposedly arrived in Ethiopia is preserved in a text called the Kebre Nagast, or Glory of Kings. According to this account, the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, traveled to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon. Their meeting produced a son, Menelik, who later traveled to visit his father as a young man. During that visit, Menelik's companions are said to have secretly taken the ark, replacing it with an indistinguishable copy, and Menelik reportedly discovered the substitution only after it was too late to return it. Solomon, according to the tradition, was furious at first but ultimately accepted the loss as the will of God, allowing the ark to remain in Ethiopia from that point forward. Access to the ark, under this tradition, is restricted to a single designated guardian monk, chosen for life, who is forbidden from ever leaving the chapel grounds once appointed, and who bears sole responsibility for its perpetual protection. This absolute restriction has only deepened the mystery surrounding the claim. Because no outside party has ever been permitted to examine the object directly, its authenticity cannot be independently confirmed by historians, archaeologists, or theologians outside the Ethiopian Church itself. In 2009, the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church publicly announced plans to unveil the Ark to the world. When the announced day arrived, no unveiling took place. Instead, church leadership stated only that they could confirm the Ark's continued existence and condition without offering any public viewing. A British academic who specialized in Ethiopian studies claimed to have examined the object held at Axum decades earlier in the 1940s and described it as a wooden container consistent with medieval rather than ancient craftsmanship, adding that in his assessment it appeared to be empty. Ethiopian church authorities have firmly disputed that account, and because the guardianship system by design prevents any outside verification, the dispute can never be definitively resolved through ordinary historical methods. It is, in the strictest sense, an unfalsifiable claim, and that very unfalsifiability is precisely what has allowed the tradition to remain so deeply and sincerely held across an entire nation's religious identity, even as it fails every standard test that conventional historical scholarship would require. Outside observers who study the tradition often note that the emotional and national significance of the claim for millions of Ethiopian believers exists almost entirely independent of whether outside historians ever accept it as physically true, which is itself a reminder that not every version of this story is really about proof at all. Beyond these major traditions, the search for the Ark has also produced its share of independent expeditions, amateur archaeologists, and self-declared discoverers, each claiming at various points over the last century to have finally located it. One American researcher spent decades searching sites across the Middle East, at one point announcing he had located the Ark beneath a hill near the site of the crucifixion itself. Sealed inside a chamber he claimed to have personally entered and photographed. No independent scholar has ever been permitted to verify those claims. No peer-reviewed excavation has ever confirmed the chamber's existence, and the photographs offered as evidence, despite decades of promotion, have never withstood serious independent scrutiny from trained archaeologists. Another researcher spent years searching caves along the Jordan Valley, convinced the copper scroll pointed toward a specific hidden vault, securing partial permission from Israeli authorities before both funding and site access were eventually withdrawn entirely. These expeditions rarely make international headlines the way the Ethiopian claim does, but they reveal something important about the emotional pull of this particular mystery. It does not just attract historians and theologians working quietly within institutions. It attracts people willing to spend entire careers, and in some cases, entire fortunes, chasing a single answer, in a search that has produced enthusiasm, funding, and occasional media attention, but never once produced the object itself, no matter how much funding, faith, or fieldwork was poured into the effort. There's one more genuine piece of physical evidence that occasionally gets pulled into this mystery, and unlike the legends and oral traditions, this one is a real, tangible artifact. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the caves near Qumran, archaeologists found something unlike any of the other texts in the collection. A scroll made not of parchment, but of hammered copper. Where the other scrolls contain religious writings, legal codes, and community rules, the copper scroll reads like an inventory of hidden treasure, listing dozens of locations where enormous quantities of gold, silver, and sacred temple vessels were supposedly buried. Some researchers have speculated that the Ark itself might be among the unnamed items referenced somewhere within that list. The problem is that the locations described in the scroll are written using geographic terms and landmarks that no modern researcher has ever been able to reliably match to actual confirmed sites on the ground. Even if the scroll genuinely does encode the Ark's final resting place somewhere within its text, that information has remained functionally useless, undecoded, for more than 70 years of continuous scholarly effort. Part of why this particular object refuses to fade from public consciousness is that it has never stayed confined to religious scholarship. It has spent the last century seeping steadily into popular culture, becoming shorthand for the idea of a lost relic so powerful that governments themselves might fear what it could unleash if rediscovered. Films, novels, and documentaries have repeatedly returned to the same core premise: an object buried somewhere in the desert, guarded by ancient traps or modern secrecy, capable of devastating anyone unprepared for its power. That fictional treatment did not invent the fascination. It borrowed it directly from the historical record itself, from a text that already described soldiers dying, cities struck by plague, and a man killed instantly for a single careless touch. The fiction simply amplified what was already there, and that amplification matters, because it means every new generation encounters the Ark first, as legend and spectacle, long before they encounter the more sober historical debate about Babylonian looting inventories and rabbinic commentary. By the time most people learn the actual evidence-based version of the story, the mythologized version has already shaped their expectations, making the plain historical answer feel almost anticlimactic by comparison, regardless of how well supported it actually is. Which finally brings us to the headline that has been circulating widely, that an advanced artificial intelligence system was asked what really happened to the Ark of the Covenant, and that the answer it gave disturbed theologians. Here is what actually happened, described honestly and without exaggeration. A large language model does not have secret access to buried archives, classified excavation reports, or a hidden decryption key for the copper scroll. It was not handed ground-penetrating radar data from beneath the Temple Mount. What it has access to is an enormous volume of publicly available text, essentially the same body of historical scholarship, theological debate, and documented speculation that any sufficiently dedicated researcher could access and read for themselves, compressed and cross-referenced at a scale and speed no individual human could match. When it was asked to synthesize everything the historical and archaeological record actually supports regarding the Ark's fate, what it produced was a fluent, confident, and carefully weighted summary of exactly the theories laid out here: the Babylonian destruction, the Jeremiah concealment legend, the Temple Mount burial theory, and the Ethiopian tradition, evaluated according to how much genuine historical evidence actually backs each one, rather than how emotionally satisfying each one happens to be. And the conclusion it reached, the one that reportedly left theologians uneasy, was not some dramatic new revelation pointing toward an undiscovered chamber or a secret coordinate on a map. It was simply the answer that the surviving evidence has always most strongly pointed toward. that the Ark was, in all likelihood, destroyed in 586 BCE, along with the rest of Solomon's temple, that the total absence of any mention of it among the detailed Babylonian looting records is far better explained by destruction than by quiet removal or careful concealment, that the deep, centuries-long theological discomfort with this plain conclusion is precisely what has driven 2.5 millennia of alternative storytelling, stories that are, in nearly every case, more emotionally satisfying than the actual historical evidence can honestly support. What unsettled people was never that a machine had uncovered some hidden secret. What unsettled people was that a system with no emotional investment in the outcome, no inherited attachment to any particular tradition, and no instinct to soften a hard conclusion for the sake of comfort, arrived at the same plain, unglamorous answer that serious historians have quietly suspected for generations, and stated it directly, without hedging and without apology. The Ark of the Covenant remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the entire history of religion and archaeology, and part of what keeps it alive is the sheer drama of the timing. It disappears at the exact moment its civilization is being destroyed, vanishing into the same fire that consumed everything else its people had built. Whether it was melted down by Babylonian soldiers who had no understanding of what they were holding, carried off by a prophet who saw the coming collapse and acted to preserve it, buried beneath the sacred ground it had occupied for 4 centuries, or transported across the Red Sea to a highland kingdom where a single guardian has watched over it in unbroken succession ever since, the story simply refuses to close. And maybe that refusal is the actual point of the story. An entire civilization built the emotional and spiritual center of its relationship with the divine around a single object, one capable, according to their own record, of striking a man dead for the crime of trying to help, of toppling a rival god without a single hand being raised against it, of being present at the exact moments when walls fell and rivers parted. The idea that something like that simply ended its existence as unmarked scrap gold inside a foreign king's treasury feels, even now, almost too small an ending for a story that large. That gap between the evidence and the emotional need for something greater is exactly what has kept this particular mystery alive through every empire that has risen and fallen in the 25 centuries since the temple burned. The Ark is gone. Precisely where it went remains, even after everything explored here, genuinely unknown. And for all its processing power, for all its access to the accumulated written record of human history, the most advanced artificial intelligence system available today could ultimately only confirm what honest historians have quietly understood for a very long time. Not a hidden chamber, not a secret coordinate waiting to be decoded. Just 25 centuries of silence and a fire that likely finished what it started long before anyone thought to write down the ending. That, in the end, might be the most unsettling answer of all.